In today's video, going to be filling out a hypothetical electoral college map between Democratic challenger Pete Buttigieg and current Republican President Donald Trump. As you can see, I've already filled out the safe states for each candidate, putting the Democrats and Pete Buttigieg at 188 electoral votes, in the Republicans with Donald Trump at 125. You need 270 electoral votes to win. We still have 225 electoral votes between all of the rest of these states to talk about, and I'm going to be giving them either to Buttigieg or Donald Trump. But before going through state by state and filling it out, I just want to do a little bit more of a discussion specifically talking about Buttigieg. So he's been gaining in the polls in recent weeks, kind of inching his way into that top four category along with the frontrunners of Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. Now, he hasn't faced much in the way of scrutiny. Throughout this process, we saw another Democratic hopeful young up-and-comer have a similar rise, with Kamala Harris really gaining quite a bit after that first debate, but then she started facing tougher questions. She was attacked more. People became more critical of her, and as a result, she immediately started fading back in the polls, and she hasn't been able to gain any of that momentum since. We'll see if that is the case or not in a similar situation that we have here with Buttigieg. Now, it hasn't been quite as immediate as it was for Kamala Harris after that first debate. It's been a little bit more steady over the past month or so. So perhaps it is a little bit more of a strength baked into that support than what we saw from Harris. But still, he has been dealt with kid gloves more or less by both the mainstream media as well as his Democratic opponents. We're starting to see that change a little bit here, and we'll see if it has an effect on him or not. But on a broader sense, if he is able to win the nomination going towards the general election, I think he's going to run into some issues, specifically issues that we kind of saw with Hillary Clinton back in 2016, but on a little bit different of a scale for Buttigieg. Now, when we look at the history of Democratic politics going into these presidential races over the past decade and a half, the strongest that the Democrats were back in 2008 with Barack Obama, where he excited a diverse coalition. On top of that, getting the excitement of the progressive base of the Democratic Party around that message of hope and change to bring to Washington. Now, this Obama coalition wasn't quite as strong in 2012, and I think that was probably, to some degree, a little bit of a dampening on that progressive excitement behind him. But then in 2016, Clinton kind of tossed that strategy aside and just went for the let's try to get moderates, center-right leaning voters, be a more corporate-friendly centrist Democrat. That strategy did not work for the Democrats in 2016, clearly, as Clinton went on to lose to Donald Trump. And Buttigieg has been positioning himself as that more corporate-friendly, moderate-type Democrat. And some issues that I think he's going to have is he won't excite the anti-corruption vote. This is a vote that went towards Donald Trump, by and large, in 2016, where he brought in that message of draining the swamp. Now, he really hasn't done that to any extent, but Buttigieg clearly isn't this candidate because he's taking that big dollar money. He's having these big money fundraisers. He's quoted as saying that you're not going to defeat Donald Trump by taking pocket change, and that was in relation to small dollar donors. The irony of that is both Bernie Sanders as well as Elizabeth Warren are outraising Pete Buttigieg by just taking that small dollar donation money. He's not the anti-corruption candidate, and he can be hammered on this quite a bit, possibly by Donald Trump in this 2020 head-to-head matchup, which could be a downside for him in comparison to putting up some of these other candidates like a Sanders or a Warren. Other issues that I think he could have is not exciting the progressive base. We saw this in 2016 where the progressive base of the Democratic Party wasn't on board with Clinton, and she suffered as a result, where that base was a little bit more so on board with Obama, specifically back in his 2008 run. He's moderated on progressive priorities, things like universal Medicare for all, health care, free college tuition at public universities, and not just moderating on it, but using Republican talking points to try to brush these aside and go in a more moderate direction. These are the kind of things that isn't going to excite that progressive base behind you and could really hurt you going towards a general election against Trump. On top of that, he clearly does not excite the African-American vote, which was a critical part of that Obama coalition, but it was also an important part of the Hillary Clinton coalition. And even with African-American voter turnout for Hillary Clinton, of course, with the Clintons' ties with the African-American community, it still wasn't enough to get her over the line in 2020. And I think that African-American vote would be much weaker for Buttigieg than what it was for a losing Democratic candidate in Hillary Clinton back in 2016. And so he's positioning himself as this more centrist, moderate, corporate-friendly type candidate to get moderates, maybe right-leaning, left-leaning independents. We'll see how that strategy works out. But I think with this type of voter block, I think his lack of experience and young age could be a negative. This was something that Clinton tried to play to her advantage, that she was the most experienced person going in and running for the presidency. That strategy probably didn't work all that well as what we saw, but Buttigieg, this is clearly something that he isn't going to be able to run on given his very young age and the fact that he's just been a mayor of a small town and doesn't really have high-level experience in that instance. So these are some of the problems that I think Buttigieg could have going into a general election. On top of that, he doesn't have great name recognition, still in contrast to candidates like a Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So the voter and the electorate as a whole just aren't as familiar with him as they are with some of these other candidates that might be a better choice or at least a tougher opposition to Trump in that 2020 matchup. So now I want to go through and fill out these states. I'm going to start west and then work my way back east and then finish off with the Midwest. So Nevada, this is a state that has been trending in a positive direction for the Democrats. They swept the statewide races in terms of the governorship and the Senate in the 2018 midterms. This was a state that Hillary Clinton was able to pick up. I think it would be really close, but still at the end of the day, I think Buttigieg would be able to grab this one. Now, I talked about a lot of the negatives that go along with Pete Buttigieg, but on the other side of that with Donald Trump, what he didn't have in 2016 that he will have going into 2020 is the incumbency advantage. And more or less, a lot of you guys that are watching this video, you're probably more engaged with politics given the fact that you're searching for this type of content. But there's a ton of voters who really don't pay all that much attention, and they just see something on the surface level like, well, the economy seems to be doing pretty well, so we're just going to continue to vote for Trump and keep the status quo as is, and I don't really pay attention to the rest of those things. So this is the type of vote that Trump could get a bit more of in 2020 that he didn't necessarily get back in 2016. So then moving down to Arizona, another one of these southwestern states that's been trending towards the Democrats, likely to be very competitive in 2020. I think Buttigieg might have a tough time, though, in relation to some of these other upper-tier Democratic hopefuls. We'll see a really close Senate race here that the Democrats have a decent shot at picking up. But Buttigieg, at the end of the day, I don't think he's going to do quite enough to be able to pick up a state like Arizona. Trump was able to win the state back in 2016 in his head-to-head against Hillary Clinton by about 3 to 4 percentage points. Likely to be close, but still giving that one as a lean over to Trump. Colorado has been a big positive for the Democrats over the past decade, and I feel like this is one that Buttigieg would continue to claim. Of course, Clinton was able to win that state back in 2016. Moving down to Texas, this is going to be a tough one for the Democrats to try to flip in 2020. The demographics are trending it in their advantage over the long term, but at least going into 2020, it's still favored for the Republicans. Trump won the state by single digits, but I believe it was around 8 or 9 percentage points against Clinton. Perhaps Buttigieg can get things maybe to 5, 6, 7, 8 percentage points, but I don't think he would be able to win the state of Texas at the end of the day. Moving up, we'll go into the 2nd Congressional District of Nebraska, an extremely close competitive district, actually really close to the state of Iowa, and perhaps that has a positive carryover for Buttigieg given the fact that he's spending a ton of time in the state and some crossover with this more populous 2nd Congressional District that's right on the Iowa border. Maybe that plays an advantage for him in the Democrats, and I really could see this one going either way, but in this instance, going to be giving it as a slight lean over to Buttigieg and the Democrats. Now I want to go into the Southeast. So we'll start with Florida. Out of all the 2018 midterm statewide races, really an area that the Republicans did the best was in Florida with flipping a Senate seat. And then on top of that, they also won a very close competitive governor race. And Trump, he put his thumb on the scale in those races, and it seemed to have a positive impact. And then also, of course, Trump winning this state back in 2016. I think he would continue to be able to carry that one against Buttigieg. And if Trump's going to win Florida, then he also probably wins Georgia. Now, the positive for the Democrats is there's been a ton of new voter registration. They've put a ton of effort into getting out more of that African-American vote, and it's already generally competitive in these statewide races. In recent election cycles, Clinton was within around 5 or so percentage points. Stacey Abrams within around 2 or so percentage points. Likely to be pretty competitive. Also, there's 2 interesting Senate races there in 2020, so a state to keep an eye on, but I don't think Pete Buttigieg makes the difference in pushing the Democrats over the line. North Carolina, a clear purple battleground state. They now have a Democratic governor who was elected more recently. Trump won the state in 2016 by around 3 or so percentage points, and I think this is a state that he is going to continue to carry in 2016 in a matchup against Buttigieg. In a lot of these states that I'm filling out for Trump, I believe that some of these other upper-tier Democratic hopefuls would have a better case to be made in trying to take down Trump in these areas, especially just based on what we're seeing in these state-by-state polls, where it's almost exclusively where Buttigieg does the worst out of all the upper-tier Democratic hopefuls in his head-to-head against Trump in comparison to what we see specifically from Sanders and Biden, and maybe to just a little bit lesser of an extent, Elizabeth Warren, but all of them tend to do a little bit better in these matchups than what we see from Buttigieg. And part of that is his relative, still unknown factor, where a lot of these voters just don't know who he is, which is playing against him. But that's a disadvantage that he would likely have going into 2020. Even if he is the general election presidential candidate for the Democrats, it's just a short period of time where not having a long history of that name recognition can be a negative in trying to win these really competitive states. Now, going up to Virginia, I think this is an area where Pete Buttigieg can do quite well. A lot of these higher educated white voters, suburban white voters that have been trending towards the Democratic Party in the state of Virginia, I think that could play well with Buttigieg's base. Going to be continuing to give that one over to the Democrats. They've shown a lot of strength in that particular state. Now I want to head up into the Northeast. I think Buttigieg is able to win statewide in Maine in a relatively, possibly competitive single-digit type result, but maybe more in the 5 to 9 percentage point range as opposed to maybe the 1 to 4 percentage point range. The second congressional district, much more conservative than the first congressional district. Trump did extremely well in the second congressional district of Maine, won it by around 10 or so percentage points, I believe. In 2016, I think Buttigieg might come up just short in that one against Trump. New Hampshire, we've actually seen Buttigieg gain quite a bit in the polls in New Hampshire, spending a lot of time there. That can possibly positively play over towards him in the general election, a state that typically leans towards the Democrats and a state that Trump has extremely poor approval numbers, so I think that that one would continue to go towards Buttigieg. So then we go into these key Midwestern states at a score of 223 for the Democrats and Buttigieg and 235 for the Republicans and Donald Trump. So first I'll start with Minnesota. Other than Illinois, the most left-leaning probably of these Midwestern states, Clinton carried the state just by the skin of her teeth. Maybe Buttigieg is able to perform just slightly better than what we saw from Clinton, where there just wasn't a great appetite for Clinton in the state of Minnesota. She did really bad in the Minnesota caucuses against Bernie Sanders. Although with the fact that Buttigieg has kind of tried to position himself more on that Clinton wing of the party, that could potentially play against him, but going to be giving this one as a lean over to Buttigieg. Moving down to Ohio, which is a state that went for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but then Trump did extremely well in this state in 2016. I think that Trump is able to carry that over into 2020 and continue to pick that one up against Buttigieg. I think Iowa could actually be extremely interesting. Now, the Democratic caucus, the polls that we've seen, Buttigieg is doing really well, but just because you're going to do well in the Democratic caucus doesn't mean necessarily that you would have the strongest head-to-head in a general election statewide with everyone participating in Iowa in terms of the Republicans, Independents, and the Democrats. Probably maybe a little bit more close than what we saw in 2016, where Clinton lost by around 10 percentage points, but still just going to be giving this one as a slight lean over to Trump in what's likely to be a competitive result. So then it gets all the way down to the three key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Buttigieg being the mayor of South Bend, perhaps he can play a bit better with these Midwestern voters. Now, in 2016, Michigan was a bit closer than even what we saw in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I believe Michigan was 0.3 percentage point margin, where Wisconsin and Pennsylvania were 0.7%. And I think that Buttigieg might be able to play a little bit better with the white voters in this area. And I say this a lot in my videos where I call Pennsylvania as a part of the Midwest, where it's really not a part of the Midwest. Technically, it's over to the east. We start going into the Midwest once we reach Ohio, but it's a similar type of demographic and voter. So that's kind of why they get lumped into this whole, being part of the Midwest, even though technically geographically they're not part of that. It's more of a demographics thing. Now, being from a bordering town, South Bend, to Michigan, perhaps that plays well for Buttigieg. But where I worry with him is the fact that the key African-American vote probably isn't going to be all that excited about going out and voting for Buttigieg. Out of these three states, Michigan is probably his best opportunity. Maybe he can do a bit better statewide among white voters to make a difference for him. Now, we saw In these 3 states, the Democrats do really well in the 2018 midterms, where they swept the governorships as well as the Senate races in all of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, Trump was able to defeat Clinton in these areas, and the fact that Buttigieg, I just don't feel like he's going to be able to get enough of the African-American voter turnout to run up the margins in areas in and around the Detroit area, in and around Milwaukee, in and around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which are key strongholds for the Democratic Party if they're going to win these statewide races. But like I said, perhaps he makes up ground for that with getting more of the white vote. We'll see if that is the case or not. I actually think he might be able to just eke one out in Michigan, being the mayor from the bordering town in South Bend. Maybe that plays something in a positive manner, although I'm not sure it has all that much of a difference in success for Buttigieg against Trump. But that's where I think Michigan would go, especially with how strong the state was for the Democrats back in 2018. But I still think that the 2 states that Hillary Clinton lost by even a little bit more than what we saw in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, I think that those still might go over to Donald Trump. Now, I could probably be convinced either way about a Buttigieg-Trump matchup in these 3 key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But I think at this point, I'd have it where Michigan maybe just a little bit of a lean towards Buttigieg, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania maybe has just a little bit of a lean over to Donald Trump. So clearly a relatively competitive race here, pretty similar to what we saw in 2016 in that Clinton versus Trump matchup. But areas where I think Buttigieg is going to struggle is trying to win that anti-corruption vote, excite the progressive base of the Democratic Party, and he just doesn't excite the African-American vote to turn out. And I think in a general election scenario, that's going to hurt him. And maybe with these moderate, conservative-type voters, his lack of experience and his young age might also be a detractor to him having success in 2020. So those are my thoughts on this electoral college map. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on this down in the comments section. I appreciate you stopping by. Consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, and hope to see you guys back here for future videos.